sound of steel breaking through steel was like a scream. A German gunner steadied his sight on a Sherman tank advancing through the smoke near Normandy in the summer of 1944. The 88-millimeter round hit with perfect accuracy. Training, doctrine, and memory told him what came next. Shermans always burned. The fireball was supposed to light up the field. Crews were supposed to vanish in an instant. It was not just belief, it was certainty hammered into the minds of every German tanker since Africa and Russia. But on that day, the certainty shattered. The shell tore through the hull. Sparks scattered inside the compartment. Dust rose. A moment of silence stretched like eternity. Then something extraordinary happened. The Sherman kept moving. Its turret turned. The 76-millimeter gun slowly traversed toward the source of the shot. The German loader froze with a round in his hand. His mouth opened, but no words came. This should not have been possible. A Sherman hit at that range was a coffin. Fire was the inevitable executioner. Yet flames did not appear. The German crew stared in disbelief. The tank they thought destroyed was alive. For the Americans inside the steel box, the seconds felt like hours. The impact had thrown them against the walls. Ears rang. Smoke stung their throats, but there was no roar of fire, no deadly heat racing through the cabin. The loader checked the racks. Nothing had ignited. The gunner steadied his scope. The commander shouted to traverse, and the machine that should have died roared back to life. That moment was not luck. It was the first glimpse of a hidden change, a quiet redesign buried deep in the structure of the tank, a design no German intelligence report had ever mentioned. Propaganda had told German soldiers that the Sherman was weak, easy to destroy, a machine built in haste. The belief ran deep because battlefield evidence had always supported it. In Tunisia, Shermans burned like kindling. In Russia, crews mocked them as rolling ovens. In every classroom, in every firing drill, German recruits were told the same truth. Strike a Sherman, and flames would follow. But the battlefield is never frozen in time. War teaches in blood and steel. The Sherman that survived in Normandy carried with it a secret from America's factories. Ammunition once stacked in open racks had been moved. Cases once left bare had been sealed in double walls. Liquid filled the space between steel and propellant. It was invisible from outside. To the Germans, nothing had changed. To the crew inside, everything had changed. The power of war is not always in new weapons. Sometimes it is in small acts of engineering that remain unseen. To a German tanker, the Sherman still looked the same outline, same turret, same rolling tracks, but the change within was the difference between fire and survival, between a battlefield grave and another sunrise. The propaganda gap widened that day. One side believed in flames that no longer came. The other side carried blankets, letters, and hope into battles where survival now had a chance. The German gunner would later tell comrades that he had struck a Sherman that refused to burn. His report was dismissed. Commanders said he was mistaken, that he had aimed wrong, that the fire would have come had he hit the right place. But the truth was far more dangerous. The truth was that German assumptions had fallen behind reality. The hook of this story is simple. War is often shaped not by what men see, but by what they fail to see. A single tank crew expected death. Instead, they lived. Their survival was no miracle. It was the result of a hidden shield, born from lessons of disaster a year earlier. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution that multiplied American strength in ways numbers alone could not explain. And all of it began with a shot that should have ended in fire but instead revealed silence. The story of survival in Normandy had its roots far away from the hedgerows. A year earlier, the fields of Tunisia told a different tale. On February 14th, 1943, fire ruled the battlefield. German 88 mm guns found their targets, and American Shermans went up in flames. More than half the tanks burned. Crews had little time to scream. For survivors, the memory of comrades sealed in burning steel haunted every waking hour. Reports gathered in the aftermath were devastating. British researchers counted 65% of knocked out Shermans burning completely. American studies gave an even higher number, sometimes 80%. The conclusion was undeniable. The Sherman was not being lost only to armor penetration. It was being lost to fire, fed by its own ammunition. The shells stacked in open racks around the fighting compartment turned each tank into a powder keg. The arrival of this knowledge hit commanders like a blow. Morale suffered. Soldiers joked darkly that climbing into a Sherman was like stepping into an oven. Parents back home read casualty lists and wondered why their sons had been given such fragile machines. Engineers at the Ordnance Department knew they had to act. Survival of men in battle depended not on thicker armor or bigger guns, but on the hidden danger inside the walls. At first, the ideas seemed wild. Some suggested filling the entire tank with water. Others imagined submarine-like compartments around the ammunition. Many doubted any real change could come fast enough, but the disaster in Tunisia forced urgency. Factories, engineers, and officers gathered in meetings where every possibility was considered. Then came a simple but radical idea. Surround the ammunition with liquid. If fire began, the liquid would smother it before it consumed the crew. It was an engineer from DuPont who first spoke the words in November 1943. He suggested liquid-filled containers. At the time, men laughed. Water in a tank seemed absurd, yet experiments began. By December, the concept had evolved into a design that made sense. Double-walled bins built into the floor, cavities filled first with water, then with water mixed with glycol, and finally with a special solution called amudamp. Production lines shifted almost overnight. The Press Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania retooled its assembly process. The first modified Shermans rolled off the line in January 1944. Their designation carried a small letter W. It stood for wet-stowage. Few beyond the factory floor understood its meaning, but for tank crews, the change was everything. Training camps in England saw the arrival of these new machines. Soldiers assigned to them did not fully grasp what had been done. To them, the tanks looked much the same, a little heavier perhaps, ammunition now stored in the floor rather than racks at their sides. Instructors explained the liquid system. Crews nodded, but some were skeptical. Could water really stop the inferno they had seen with their own eyes? Men carried the memory of Tunisia with them. Some had lost friends in burning tanks. Others had seen smoke rising from valleys filled with blackened steel. To believe that such horror could be reduced by a few gallons of fluid required faith. Still, they listened. Still, they learned to load shells from the floor bins. Still, they inspected gauges and seals. In the quiet of the barracks, men spoke of home. Letters were passed around, photographs pinned to wooden walls. A few carried blankets stitched by mothers or wives. These small objects seemed fragile against the roar of artillery. Yet in those moments, the tanks no longer felt like ovens. They felt like the uncertain promise of another chance. By spring of 1944, hundreds of modified Shermans waited in the English countryside. They were hidden among hedgerows, parked under camouflage nets, lined in rows like silent giants. Few soldiers realized how much their fate had already changed. German intelligence certainly did not. Their manuals still declared the Sherman weak, their gunners still trained to aim at ammunition racks, no longer there. The arrival of wet stowage had come quietly. No fanfare, no headlines, only steel, water, and faith carried forward into the storm that was about to break over Normandy. War is a clash of machines and nations. But for the men inside those machines, life reduced itself to routines. By the spring of 1944, American crews trained with Shermans that carried wet stowage ammunition bins. They did not yet know that this quiet design would shape their survival. What they knew were drills, inspections, and the daily rhythm of soldier life. Morning began with the metallic scrape of boots on gravel. Engines coughed awake across the camp. Mechanics checked fuel lines. Commanders barked orders. Crews climbed into their turrets and practiced again and again the motions of combat. Loaders bent at the waist, reaching down into the floor bins for shells. The motion felt unfamiliar. In older models, ammunition had been at shoulder height in racks. Now it was below their feet. At first, men complained. It slowed them down. It cramped their space. But instructors insisted survival depended on habit, and habit could only be built through repetition. Inside the tanks, the smell of oil and damp canvas clung to everything. Light filtered through narrow hatches. The walls sweated in cold mornings. Crews worked in silence at times, broken only by the clatter of shells and the click of latches. One soldier wrote later that the tank felt like a submarine turned upright. He said that each day was practice, not only for war, but for trust. Trust that the walls would hold. Trust that the liquid around the shells would do its work if the worst happened. Yet life was not only steel and drills. In pockets and bedrolls, men carried fragments of home, a photograph folded until the edges wore white, a letter read so many times the paper had grown soft, a blanket stitched by a mother's hand, carried from barracks to tank to field. These small objects were lifelines against the thunder of engines and the fear of battle. They offered comfort. During breaks between drills, men sat on crates sharing stories. Cigarette smoke curled through the air. They spoke of farms in Iowa, streets in New York, factories in Ohio. They spoke of girls they hoped to marry, children they hoped to see. For a moment, laughter replaced fear. Yet always at the edges of talk lay memory. Tunisia was never far away. Even among new recruits, the stories of burned Shermans circulated. No man forgot that war had once turned their tanks into furnaces. The instructors repeated the lesson daily. Wet stowage reduced the chance of fire from more than 60% to less than 15. It was not a guarantee. It was not invincibility, but it was hope made mechanical. The crews learned to check the fluid levels, to tighten seals, to replace corroded fittings. Some joked that they were more plumbers than tankers, but they still obeyed. They knew each drop of liquid might mean life or death. Evenings settled heavy on the camps. After engines shut down and drills ended, quiet returned. Men lay in their bunks, staring at rafters or canvas ceilings. The distant sound of waves or wind through hedges filled the silence. Letters were unfolded again. Words from home were read in whispers. A blanket was pulled tighter against the chill. One young loader remembered writing in his diary that the tank no longer felt like a coffin. He said it felt like a gamble he might win. In his words, the routine had changed him. He did not believe in invincibility, but he believed in the chance to return home. That chance gave weight to every drill. It gave meaning to every shell loaded from the floor. Routine prepared them for the storm that was coming. Normandy waited, the hedgerows waited, and somewhere across the channel, German gunners still believed the Sherman would always burn. The battlefield of Normandy was not only a place of steel and fire, it was also a place of waiting. Between offensives and counterattacks, crews rested beside their machines. One Sherman stood in a muddy field, its hull scarred by shrapnel. The paint was scorched in places where flame had licked but not taken hold. The men around it were silent. They had survived what should have been their last fight. Inside the tank, a young driver unfolded a blanket. The cloth was worn thin at the edges, patched where time had frayed it. His mother had stitched it before he left home. A simple pattern, nothing grand. Yet in the gloom of the turret, it became more than fabric. It became a shield of memory. He spread it across the cold steel floor and sat with his back against the wall. The smell of oil mixed with the faint cedar that still clung to the fibers. For a moment, the war receded. Outside was mud and smoke. Inside was warmth and silence. He thought of his mother's kitchen, of steam rising from a pot on the stove, of laughter drifting through the window. The blanket bridged those two worlds. It was proof that he was still alive, proof that the tank had not become his grave. The crew watched him. None spoke. Each man carried his own relic, a photo of a wife, a rosary, a tin cup, but the blanket touched them in a different way. It was something they could see, something they could touch, a reminder that survival was not abstract. It was present. It was real. The German shell that should have ended them had not. And here was the evidence. A man alive, wrapped in the comfort of home. German gunners across the hedgerows were still firing. They did not know why some Shermans kept fighting. They did not see the liquid-filled bins inside. They did not see the small rituals crews carried out after battle. To them, the survival of these tanks was an insult to logic, but to the men inside, it was a miracle grounded in design. The driver clutched the blanket tighter as night fell. He thought of comrades lost in Tunisia, men who never had the chance to sit with such comfort. Survivors sometimes carried guilt as heavy as armor plates. Why had he lived when others had burned? Why did his tank stand when others did not? The blanket did not erase that burden, but it gave him a way to bear it. The blanket became a symbol for the crew. Each time they returned from battle, they unfolded it again. It was draped over knees, spread across laps, even used as a pillow during restless hours in the mud. The commander once joked that the blanket was their lucky charm, yet in truth it was more. It was the visible proof of invisible change. Just as the wet stowage bins were hidden inside the hull, the blanket was hidden inside their hearts. Both were shields, both were lifelines. Symbols carry weight in war. Soldiers cling to them when logic fails. A blanket in a tank may seem small, but to men who lived with death at every corner, it became a quiet anchor. It reminded them that they were more than soldiers. They were sons, brothers, husbands. They were men who still dreamed of warmth beyond the front lines. In later years, the driver would keep the blanket in a trunk. He would take it out only rarely to show his children or grandchildren. He would tell them of nights in Normandy, of shells that should have burned them, of mornings when the blanket was the only comfort between fear and faith. To those who listened, it seemed an ordinary piece of cloth, but to him, it was the thread that tied survival to memory. The war was far from over, but in that moment, wrapped in his mother's gift, he felt that survival was possible. And in war, belief is as powerful as armor. Belief is the strongest armor a soldier carries. In 1944, German tank crews believed they understood the Sherman. They had been told again and again that one well-placed shot meant fire. Their manuals carried diagrams of ammunition racks glowing red, targets marked out as if painted by certainty. Their instructors repeated it like scripture. Strike the sides, hit the sponsons, watch the enemy burn. Yet in Normandy, the pattern broke. German gunners reported hits that should have ended the fight, but Shermans kept moving. Flames did not appear. Crews fought back when they should have been destroyed. The contradiction gnawed at them. A loader remembered later that his hand shook when the tank he fired upon returned fire. He had been taught that the Sherman was weak. To see one survive was like seeing the ground vanish beneath his feet. Commanders dismissed these reports. They said the crews had aimed poorly, that the shells had struck at bad angles, that the ammunition had not been hit. Doctrine did not change. Manuals were not rewritten. The belief was held tighter the more it was threatened. To admit the truth would have been to admit that German intelligence had failed. Inside the Sherman crews, the crisis of belief took another form. They lived, they fought, but survival carried its own weight. Men remembered friends, burned alive in Tunisia or Sicily. They remembered opening hatches to smoke and silence. Now they found themselves alive after penetrations that should have ended them. Relief was quickly followed by guilt. Why them and not others? Why now and not then? One American gunner wrote in a letter home that he could not stop thinking of a battle where his tank had been hit twice and yet kept fighting. He said he thanked God for his life, but could not forget the faces of those who had burned in tanks a year earlier. The modification saved his body, but not his conscience. He wrapped himself in the blanket at night, not only for warmth, but to hold back the tide of memory. Crews began to speak quietly among themselves. They admitted fear of being next. They admitted shame at their survival. Some believed the liquid bins were a blessing. Others believed they had simply been lucky. War makes men doubt even the tools meant to save them. Each time they climbed into their tanks, they touched their relics, a photo, a rosary, a blanket. They prayed the shield within the steel would hold again. The Germans wrestled with the opposite crisis. For them, disbelief was a chain that bound their tactics. They continued to aim at the wrong places. They continued to expect fire where none came. Some tankers whispered that the Americans had learned something new, but without official confirmation, whispers faded into silence. War leaves little room for questioning orders. The crisis of belief spread like smoke on both sides. For Germans, it was denial. For Americans, it was guilt. Both weighed heavy on men who already carried too much. A German commander later admitted in a diary that his men no longer trusted their training. He wrote that they fired with desperation rather than certainty. For an army built on doctrine, that desperation was poison. For American crews, doubt turned inward. They began to ask what survival meant. Was it a gift to be carried with gratitude, or was it a burden measured against the dead? The blanket in the Sherman became not only a symbol of comfort, but also of guilt. Its warmth reminded them of home, but it also reminded them that many would never feel such warmth again. Belief once shattered can never be repaired. It can only be replaced. The men in Normandy were caught in that transition. The Germans clung to a broken truth. The Americans learned to live with a new one. Between those two states of mind, the battles raged on, and in every fight, men discovered that the hardest part of survival was not the shell that missed, but the doubt that remained. The battles of Normandy rolled into the summer and autumn of 1944. Tanks clashed in hedgerows, villages, and open fields. Shermans were hit again and again. Some burned, but more than ever before, many survived. The difference was not always obvious on the battlefield. A tank struck by a German round often stopped in place. Smoke rose. Crews bailed out or stayed low. To an enemy, watching through binoculars, the machine looked destroyed. Yet hours later, the same tank might be dragged back by recovery vehicles, patched by mechanics, and returned to the fight. For American crews, the aftermath of battle became a new routine. Recovery units scoured fields for every Sherman that could be saved. Mechanics worked beneath lamps, their hands slick with oil and mud. They replaced plates, patched holes, and inspected ammunition bins. The smell of scorched steel hung heavy in the workshops, but many tanks that would once have been permanent losses now came back to life. Statistics told the truth that rumors could not. Third Army reported that more than 60% of Shermans knocked out in battle were repaired and returned. Numbers like these meant everything to commanders planning offensives. A battalion that should have been shattered still had strength. A spearhead expected to collapse kept moving forward. German calculations that assumed permanent destruction were quietly undone. For the men inside these tanks, survival brought complicated feelings. Relief was real. Each battle survived was a gift. Yet memory pressed close. Crews remembered comrades lost in earlier campaigns. They remembered burned out hulks littering desert valleys. Now they sat inside tanks that refused to die as easily. Some felt blessed, others felt haunted. One gunner recalled staring at the patched walls of his Sherman, thinking of the man who had once loaded shells beside him in Tunisia. That man had not lived to see the change. The guilt lingered like smoke that never cleared. The blanket remained with the crew. Each time they returned from battle, it was unfolded again. It was spread across laps, while the engine ticked in cooling silence. It was clutched during nights when dreams were filled with fire. To the driver, it became more than memory. It became ritual. Every time he touched the fabric, he was reminded that survival was not chance alone. It was design, sacrifice, and the quiet work of men far from the front who had imagined a better way. Letters written after battles carried this tone. Tankers described the strange resilience of their machines. They wrote of hits that should have destroyed them, of smoke that cleared without fire. Families at home read these letters with a mix of pride and fear. To them, it sounded like a miracle. To the men writing, it felt like carrying the weight of ghosts. The aftermath was not only mechanical, but emotional. Survivors bore the mark of their experiences in silence. They did not always speak of it. They carried it in their eyes, in their posture, in the way they folded their relics at night. The war asked them to return again and again to machines that had nearly killed them. Yet return they did, because the machine was no longer the same. For the Germans, the aftermath looked different. Reports filtered up the chain about Shermans surviving impossible hits. Some officers dismissed them, others ignored them. Manuals still said the same thing: the Sherman should burn. Crews on the front lines knew better, but their knowledge rarely reached higher command. The gap between belief and reality grew wider with each passing week. In later years, many veterans spoke of this period not as triumph, but as endurance. They described it as living on borrowed time. Every battle could have been their last. The difference now was that survival had become more likely. That likelihood gave them strength. It gave them courage. It gave them the fragile hope that they might see home again. And always, when the fighting paused, the blanket returned. It was spread across steel that had taken the blows of war. It was held close in silence. It was the link between battles survived and a life waiting far away. The aftermath of war was not only measured in statistics or tanks repaired. It was measured in the quiet moments when men held symbols of home and realized they had been spared once more. The war did not end in a single battle. It ended in fragments of memory carried across years and continents. For the men who fought in Sherman's, the legacy of survival lived far beyond 1945. They returned home, some with scars, many with silence. Yet inside trunks and attics lay reminders of what had carried them through: a folded blanket, a letter creased by damp hands, a diary scribbled in pencil inside a turret. These objects were small, but their meaning stretched across decades. Post-war studies confirmed what the veterans already knew. Shermans with wet stowage burned far less often. Fire that once consumed entire crews was reduced to a fraction. Analysts at the Operations Research Office recorded numbers. Pre-modification tanks burned 60 to 80% of the time after a hit. Wet stowage reduced that to barely 10 to 15%. Those numbers meant thousands of men lived. Behind every statistic was a face. Behind every percentage was a father, a son, a brother who came home. Yet the legacy was more than numbers. It was the quiet truth that small changes can alter the fate of nations. German intelligence never recognized the modification. Their manuals remained frozen in 1943. Their gunners kept aiming for weak points that no longer existed. Their commanders miscalculated strength, assuming losses that had not occurred. Entire offensives were planned on illusions. When tanks returned to battle after supposed destruction, German strategies collapsed. The war was shaped not only by weapons of terror, but by hidden shields unnoticed by the enemy. For the Americans, the legacy carried weight. Survivors spoke in interviews years later of how they had lived when they should have died. They remembered the moment of silence after a shell struck. They remembered realizing the tank had not ignited. One said it felt like the world had given him back his breath. Another said he never looked at his blanket without thinking of the fire that had not come. The blanket itself became a living symbol. The driver who carried it through Normandy kept it folded in a trunk for the rest of his life. He brought it out only on rare evenings. He showed it to his children, telling them about mud and smoke, about how the cloth had been with him when death knocked but did not enter. His grandchildren later remembered the smell of cedar that lingered faintly in the fabric. To them, it was not just a blanket, it was history woven into thread. Museums would one day display Shermans. Tourists would climb onto the hulls. Guides would explain armor thickness, gun caliber, and engine type. But few would speak of the liquid-filled bins hidden in the floor. Few would speak of the engineers who imagined water as a weapon against fire. The legacy of wet stowage remained almost invisible. Just as it had been during the war, its greatest strength was its silence. And yet, silence can carry. Veterans carried it with them. In every memory of battles survived, families carried it in every letter that arrived. Instead of a telegram of loss, nations carried it in the momentum of victories, built on tanks that kept returning to the fight. The war was not won by perfection of machines, but by resilience, by small changes that multiplied into vast outcomes. In the decades after the war, the lesson lingered. Innovation does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it hides inside steel walls. Sometimes it is stitched into a blanket carried from home. Sometimes it is found in the ordinary act of survival. The men who lived through Normandy and beyond knew this truth. They knew that history is not only shaped by the great offensives and the speeches of generals, it is also shaped by the quiet engineering that saves lives, and the symbols that keep men human amid ruin. The legacy of the Sherman's hidden shield is not only that it shortened the war or saved battalions, it is that it proved the value of small mercies. A tank that did not burn gave a crew another sunrise. A blanket carried across the mud gave a soldier the strength to believe he could make it home. That is the story that endures, the story of men who survived because someone imagined water around steel, the story of families who saw their sons return because a machine refused to ignite, and the story of symbols, letters, blankets, prayers that kept humanity alive even when the world seemed determined to destroy it.